Hello, my name is David Pluviose, and welcome to In the Margins. In this episode, we are so pleased to have with us as our guest Dr. M. Roy Wilson, president of Wayne State University. He has a new memoir out, The Plum Tree Blossoms Even in Winter. And he just talks about his fascinating personal story and opines on a number of pressing issues that we're faced with in this society. So, Dr. Wilson, welcome to In the Margins. Thank you so much for joining us. And, the first question I want to ask you is, what was behind your decision to write this memoir and to delve, so deeply into your background, because the portrait that is painted is so vivid and rich, going back to your childhood. So, what was behind your decision to write this memoir? And I was wondering if you talk about that process.
Sure. Well, David, first of all, let me just say that it's really a pleasure to do this with you. And you hit the nail on the head. The question you just asked is one of two most frequently asked questions that I get. The second one being, what's the significance of the title? But the one that I get the most is the one you just asked. And so let me just mention that real quick. So I had always thought that I would probably write a story, my story, because not so much that I think that, others haven't had challenging lives. Some people have had even more challenging lives than I have, but I haven't quite heard the exact same type of story, mainly because part of it is I'm bicultural. I grew up in Japan, and a lot of the story relates to that and racial identification and those kinds of things. And part of the challenges that I faced were more unique to being in Japan rather than in this country. And I initially was going to write my story after I was finished with my presidency, and I was thinking of doing it then because, as you said, I do reveal a lot, and it's very personal, and I'm a very private person. So people are pretty shocked that I went as far as I did. The reason why I did is because I felt that it may have greater impact while I'm a sitting president. That students who have challenging situations in their own lives can read this and say, well, you know what, there's a way out. He did it. I can also. And I just thought that it might have a bigger impact than when I was retired and, has been president. So that's why I wrote the story now, and why I decided to go ahead and write it. I will also say that it was deeply cathartic to write it. Once I made that decision to do so, words started flowing out because I had so many things that I had repressed over decades that I just felt like, well, why am I keeping all this in when I can express this and maybe hopefully help some people.
It's interesting that you talk about the impact on the readers of this book. Obviously, as a sitting president, as you know, students who walk by the ivory tower, a lot of them, are in the struggle that you were in, that you described, right? It's interesting as we've covered what has happened with COVID, for instance. One of the big concerns with this pandemic was a potential lost generation of college students who had to struggle to get to the point of entering college to begin with. If they were a first generation student, if they were impoverished, major struggles to get there, just to be told, hey, campus is closed, got to get your internet and study space together at home, should you want to access higher education. And so the struggles of so many to even get to the door of higher education. I think that in reading your story, so many can be helped and inspired to know that they can make it, right? And I think that's probably one of the more powerful messages that this book contains. And I just wonder if you could talk specifically to the audience of this book, the many young people who don't see a future for them, right? Maybe I got to cobble together a few minimum wage jobs, to make it, right? It may not be worth the struggle for higher education, but certainly your career is an exemplar of the fact that, hey, if you invest in yourself with regards to a higher education, the payoff can be tremendous. And so I was wondering if you talk about the audience of this book, particularly to the students who struggle so much and may think the struggle for higher education may not be worth it.
Yeah, thanks for that question, David. Certainly, I just want to repeat again that the struggles and challenges that many young people face now, in no way do I want to make it seem like mine were greater. They were different, but I see challenges and barriers that students have to face all the time being in a public urban university. And I get inspired by seeing what how they get through that, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes they give up. Sometimes they do get through it. And the significance of the title, this might be a good time to talk about that because it's directly is related to your question. The Plum Tree Blossoms Even in Winter. Why did I name it that? Well, two reasons. One is that I begin with image of the plum tree in the prologue and talk about that. And then at the very end, when my mother died, I put this etching of the plum tree, the same one that I had gotten and that I described in the prologue, in her casket. And so it was the very last thing. So it kind of bookends the entire story, and in between, obviously, I've got a bunch of other stuff in there. But the significance of the plum tree is that unlike most blossoming trees that, like the cherry blossom, that blossom in the spring in May, the plum tree actually blossoms in the dead of winter, in the dreariest, darkest, coldest time of the year, typically February. And so the metaphor is that even when things are dark and dreary, that something beautiful can come out of it. So it's a metaphor for resilience, for hope, for perseverance. And the story behind that is that one of my very earliest memories with my mother and I were alone together for first 4 or 5 years of my life before my dad came into the picture. One of the earliest memories I have of her was when she took me to a cherry blossom festival. And that's kind of a big thing in Japan, going to see the cherry blossoms. People do it now all the time in Washington, D.C., for example. So it's nice. So we went on this cherry blossom festival. And afterwards, we went to the Shinto shrine for my mother to pray. At the shrine, there was a little memento kind of store. And I saw an etching, a picture with an inscription on it that looked to me like cherry blossoms. And I wanted her to buy it for me so I could remember the day. And when we went home, I asked her to read the inscription. And the inscription was, "The plum tree blossoms even in winter." You can't imagine how disappointed I was, because I thought it was cherry blossoms. And that's the reason why I had asked to buy it, and it's the plum blossoms instead. But continued to have so much significance. When I found out later about the significance of the plum tree, I kept it for my entire life, that inscription and that picture. And as I said later, I put it in my mother's casket when she died. It gave me a lot of strength throughout my life, knowing that a better time is ahead, that even in the darkest of times, there's hope. And it gave me strength when my mother died, because that was a dark time for me.
In this book, you also highlight a number of course, career milestones, in your life. And I was wondering if you could talk about some of the pivot points in your life, right? Some of the key moments. Of course, you mentioned that I think it was an English teacher that
Miss Stephan
played a pivotal role in your life. And it's interesting, even reflecting on my own college experience, right? It always seems to be an individual or a couple of individuals that because of their influence. Like, for instance, myself, I went to a majority institution. There were only a handful of people who looked like me, right? And so the one or two faculty member who happened to be African American, of course, all of us are flocking for advising and trying to find community. I was wondering if you could talk about the individuals in your life who you, of course, identified as pivotal in terms of really helping you make that transition to the trajectory that puts you at the place you are now. And I was wondering if you talk about your own work with regards to paying this forward, right? Understanding that for so many students in the struggle, it's really that person who identifies with them in some way, invests in them, even the higher education space, that can make all the difference. I was wondering if you talk about the individuals in your life that helped you pivot to success, and in your work as a higher education leader, how that experience has informed you in terms of some of the leaders that you select and some of the faculty members that you've placed in positions of influence.
Yeah, sure. So let me start by saying that I've been fortunate in having a number of great mentors, and I describe some of them in the book. But the one that probably had the most pivotal role in my life, partly because of the time in which she entered my life, was Miss Stephan. She was my English teacher. And a couple of things to note. She had polio and was disabled. Well, I shouldn't say she was disabled. She was handicapped, but she did everything that a non-crippled person would be able to do: drive with a special contraction in her car and so forth. But she taught me that there's discrimination in life, and to guard against it. And she helped me, see what some of those barriers might be. But at the time that she entered my life, I was really running the streets a lot in the Washington, D.C. area. I was a 3-sport athlete, and if I wasn't in sports practice, I was just running the streets. I don't know what else to say. I didn't spend much time doing anything else. And when she came into my life, she really took me aside, because I was always sleeping in her class, but she thought I was a smart guy. And after bawling me out, she struck a deal with me that I could sleep in her class, but I had to do extra assignments in my own time. And she made me read all these different books and quiz me on it every week outside of class. And not just books, but things outside of academics. She tutored me on. For example, I was a little nervous about going to my high school prom, because I really didn't know about formal dining, and she took me to a French restaurant. I still remember La Niçoise in Georgetown, and showed me about which fork to use, which knife to use, and the niceties of formal dining. Even had a bottle of wine, which I still remember is a Louis Jadot Palmade. It's a French Burgundy. And I remember taking a sip of that wine and thinking, oh my God, this is what wine tastes like. Up until then, I just had Boone's Farm and Thunderbird, and I thought that was supposed to be what it's supposed to taste like. So she taught me a lot outside of just academics, but certainly, getting me, out of the streets, encouraging me to go to college, not just to play basketball, but to actually go to a place where I could concentrate. And thinking about going to med school was something that she did. And I remember my first semester, I wasn't doing well because I hadn't been well prepared in high school, and neither of my parents went to college or anything like that, so I didn't know what to expect, and it was a lot harder than I expected. And she actually flew up to Allegheny College, where I was, and went to speak to my teachers, one of who I thought was giving me a hard time, and advocated on my behalf. And that just turned my whole academic career around at that time. I ended up graduating with about a 3.9 out of a 4.0 grade point average. And that's after not doing well my first semester. So basically, I got all A's after that. So that turned my life around. So I can't even, count all the different ways that she impacted my life. Those are the highlights. And in terms of playing it forward, one of the things that I've done my entire career is try to help, all students, but particularly minority students, get into whatever it was I was involved with when I was chair of ophthalmology, get into the residency program. When I ran research centers, get minority kids into research programs, and now as president, trying to help them navigate the rigors of academics and develop special programs for them, and in the hopes that they would go into academics themselves. And so that's something that I enjoy doing. I hope to do more of when I'm done with my presidency. I've got a number of different ideas of how I can do that, and it's my way of giving back. And at any one time, I've got dozens of mentors throughout the country that I work with. Mentees throughout the country that I work with.
It's interesting. The last, of course, few years, of course, we've seen a nationwide flashpoint on issues of systemic racism. Of course, we know what happened with the killing of George Floyd, but of course there were so many others that I think with this lockdown that we've experienced, it really was a time of introspection for so many. And when it comes to this pandemic, every time you read a story about mortality rates, of African Americans and other underrepresented minorities, as opposed to the majority populations, these disparities, something like COVID just makes it plain what are the ripple effects of systemic racism. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your work in that area when it comes to understanding disparities among racial and socioeconomic lines, how such disparities affect those in minority populations, and what the potential is by filling the pipeline with more, let's say, African American or Latino or Asian, more underrepresented minorities in the pipeline, if we just talk about medicine. And so I was wondering if you talk a little bit about what COVID revealed in terms of what we all knew was the case with regards to systemic racism, and what's the potential for other institutional leaders as they look to solve the problem by way of potentially perhaps getting more doctors, if you want to talk about that, who look like their patients as a result of really tackling some of these systemic racism issues.
Yeah. So your question had a lot in it, and so let me try to,
Apologies.
Yeah. Yeah, untangle some of that. First of all, I do talk about racism quite a bit in my book, and my premise is that any Black man my age has encountered racism, but there's also a generational difference in terms of what my father experienced and what my kids experience, in trying to understand that. And I used to be very critical of people like Tiger Woods, who didn't embrace their Blackness and came up with their own definition of what they were, Caucasian and so forth. But I understand it a lot better now, and I talked about the generational difference. But basically, every person, every Black man my age has experienced it, and I talked about some of those experiences that I've had. In terms of the health disparities, and COVID specifically, COVID, and you hit the nail on the head in terms of COVID being able to teach us something about the wider area of health disparities, whether it's cardiovascular disease or whatever. And the reason is because the time span in COVID for an outcome is so short. It's either, you get sick or go to the hospital, or you die. And that time frame is measured in days to weeks. Whereas, well, let's say cardiovascular disease, for example, that time frame is measured in decades. And so it's harder to see the effect of the health disparities over 30 years, whereas it's very easy to see it over a span of a week or two. But what's really encouraging is that on the discouraging side, first of all, one of the things that we did notice about COVID, and what we learned, is that it is a social determinants of health. It's where you live and who you live with, and the other conditions upon which you live, and not necessarily any inherent biological issues. And it's also how doctors treated you, the implicit bias issue. And so we learned a lot more about the fact that if we could change the social determinants of health, that we should be able to impact health disparities. I learned about health disparities when I was an intern at Harlem Hospital Center, and I talk about this in my book. Every Harlem Hospital Center, this was at a time when Harlem really was Black and poor. And that was a bustling hospital, and I spent a lot of my time in the emergency room there. And I saw this one patient, I think his name was Luke, almost every day for a span of time. He would come in with this, ascites, this water in his belly all the time, and we would drain it, tell him to, stop eating so much salt in his food, and then, that'd be it. Well, how can he stop eating salt in his food? I mean, his diet is potato chips and whatever else he could find to subsist. So he would always come back, and we would drain him again and send him back out. And then one day he didn't come back anymore, and I inquired about him, and he had died because of liver complications. And I knew that if he had been in a different socioeconomic status with health insurance, that long ago we would have intervened with a shunt or something else that was more definitive than just draining his fluid and not taking care of the underlying problem, which is that he lived in an impoverished area, didn't have access to food, didn't have access to exercise, didn't have access to a lot of things that we know impact health. So that was my lesson, my first lesson in terms of health disparities. And my interest in that drove me to study health disparities from an eye standpoint, and I studied glaucoma, particularly in African Americans. And my study was uh, actually the first population-based study that showed that Blacks have a higher prevalence of glaucoma, and that the severity of the glaucoma is worse. And part of that interest stemmed from the fact that I noticed these health disparities as an intern. The other part that drove me into studying glaucoma, and I revealed this in my book, there are a number of health conditions that I reveal, some of which is shocking to people, because if you know me, I'm a really healthy person. I'm very athletic. I cycle all the time, and people think I'm just a picture of strength and health. But I'm also very vulnerable, as everyone. And I ended up getting glaucoma at the age of 28. I accidentally found out about it. And my own work made me realize that, first of all, this is rare. Usually it's a disease of the elderly. And my own work made me realize that the chances of my going blind in my lifetime was very high. And that influenced, what I studied, how intently I studied it, and actually influenced the fact that I went into administration thinking that I was not going to be able to have a career as an ophthalmic surgeon. So it had a great influence on me. Now, luckily, the good part of the story is that my glaucoma has miraculously been very, very stable. And, my visual field is just about normal. And I've had no impact from the glaucoma whatsoever. And it's been now, 40 years later. So I feel comfortable in telling that story, but I thought that it was important that people know, because it has such an impact on what I studied and what I ended up doing as a career choice.
I was wondering if you talk a little bit about the opportunities that you've had at Wayne State as a university president. Obviously, your career had a number of pit stops, but at Wayne State, there's so much influence that you have on not only the university community, but on the wider community, especially in Detroit, looking at so many needs. And so I was wondering if you could talk about some of the opportunities that you have had to impact the lives of the most vulnerable, both on the campus and perhaps off, from your vantage point as president of Wayne State.
Yeah, so I'm entering into my 10th year at Wayne State. When I first came in 2013, one of the things that drew me to Wayne State was I wanted to be at a public university. I wanted to be urban. I wanted to be research intensive. I wanted to have a medical school, and I wanted it to be I wanted to be diverse. And then finally, I wanted to be intricately connected to the community, because I felt those are my values, and I felt very strongly about that. And part of what Wayne State has done has been part of the resurgence of Detroit, particularly in the Midtown area. The two, Detroit and Wayne State, are really just tied it to the hips. If Detroit doesn't do well, Wayne State doesn't do well, and vice versa. So if Detroit does well, Wayne State does well. And so I've been very involved with the broader community, because as president of Wayne State, I thought that it impacted Wayne State, how the broader community functioned. And so it's been a close partnership. I think that we've helped out the community, and I think the community has helped us out. A good example is our police force, our public safety officers. At a time when Detroit police was taking over an hour to respond to a call, our public safety officers will respond in under a minute, wherever you were in the Midtown area. Well, what happens when you have that kind of response? Well, you feel more comfortable in opening up a business. You feel more comfortable in coming down and living in those areas. And then you start having density and you start thriving. The area starts thriving. And as the area thrives, then so does the university, because students want to be in a thriving area where there's a lot happening, restaurants and things like that. So it's a situation where one helps the other, but there's no way that you can separate what Wayne State does and what the community does. It's just that connected.
My final question is with regards to the future. You've mentioned that, even moving forward, there are some initiatives, there are some passions of yours that you expect to continue for some time to come. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you see for yourself moving forward. What are the passions that you intend to pursue? And as an addendum to that question, what are you hoping that your readers take from this particular book as lessons, both, let's say, students and leaders who hope to make a difference as you have?
So I'll tell you one that is not surprising, and maybe one that's a bit more come out of left field. The one that's not surprising, and I mentioned it in my book, is that, I'm really passionate about academic medicine, not just minorities in academic medicine, or let me put that, not just minorities in medicine, but in academic medicine. Only about 2.7% of academic medicine faculty are underrepresented minorities, are Black. And, population, of course, is closer to 13 or 14%. So it is really underrepresented. And if you don't have, and you mentioned this earlier, if you don't have Black faculty, then, how do you get students coming behind you who look up to you and try to be like you? And so that's something that I care a lot about, and I try to increase the pipeline of Black academics, particularly Black academics in medicine. So I'll continue to do that, and I'll do it with even greater fervor than I've been doing it, because I'll have more time once I retire from the presidency. The other thing that I would say is that when I was younger, both in high school through college, and then even partly through medical school, I was known as a pretty good writer. And I think it's because of my English teacher. And I remember Dean Fetterman, who was the dean of students at Harvard Medical School, where I went to medical school, telling me one time that he thought that I was going to, that one of my contributions would be through writing, that because he thought I was a good writer, whether it was some sort of fictional way or something that was non-medical. I never really thought about it, and I think my writing skills have diminished over the years because when scientific writing and creative writing are two different kind of things, and I became a good scientific writer for all these papers and stuff, but I lost my creativity. Writing this book has kind of reignited my passion for creative writing. And I think I may take a crack at writing actually historical fiction or something.
Sounds great.
Oh, and then you had a second part of that question.
Yeah, I did. My final question was with regards to takeaways. There are leaders.
So right. Yeah. So the takeaway really is that there are challenges in life, that we all face them, but that regardless of how challenging a situation may be, how dark a time may be, that just like the plum tree that blossoms in the darkest, coldest time of the year, that there's a way forward, and to persevere and make it out, and use the plum tree as the symbol to be able to do that.
Well, Dr. Wilson, I just want to say thank you so very much for writing this memoir. first of all, because, for people who are in higher education, who reflect on their years, who've been in the struggle, it is invaluable to be able to get perspective from somebody who has been in a struggle and has overcome. So just want to say thank you for sharing your story. And I'm going to hold up this book for our YouTube audience. This book is just fantastic. The Plum Tree Blossoms Even in Winter. Dr. Wilson, thank you for your time. Thank you for your insight. Thank you for sharing your story. I think that the audience of leaders, students across the board will gain tremendously from your insight. And thanks again for joining us on In the Margins. Appreciate you.